Think you're still on the battlefield? A burst of laughter echoed as the old man strode into the café in his faded uniform. Yet no one in that room could have guessed what would unfold just 2 hours later. A simple act, a past thought long forgotten, and a truth that would force the entire town to look at itself anew. What would you do if you witnessed this? Stay with us until the end, for this is a story whose tears will not be of pity, but of respect. All right, my dear audience, get ready for a story that will leave you in awe. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly empathize with what I'm about to share. And leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see viewers joining us from every corner of the globe. Harold Knox, 76, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho, once filled with his wife's laughter for 38 years. She died of cancer nearly a decade ago, and since then, the kitchen was silent, the chair beside his forever empty. Yet every Thursday morning, he rose without fail, pressed his old uniform into neat creases, polished the scuffed boots, now faded, and drove to Eagle Diner, a roadside cafe where he'd once sat with old comrades, reminiscing about days of smoke and fire. The uniform no longer fit his broad shoulders. Its waist strained over his belly. The sleeves hung loose from arms thinned by time. But Harold wore it, not for show, not for attention, but because every stitch, every hand-mended tear by his wife, every small medal pinned to his left breast was a fragment of memory for those who would never grow old as he had. Each step he took was measured, his left foot dragging slightly, an echo of the shrapnel lodged in his leg from the highlands of the Western Front. Yet he never complained. Some pains stay close so long they become part of your natural gait. Harold did not come to the diner to socialize. He came to be present, to hold on to the last vestiges of memory. Every visit found him at the same corner table by the window. The two-seat table now held only one, his hand resting lightly on its surface, his eyes occasionally drifting to the empty chair opposite, where his dearest friend, Charlie, had once sat before lung disease consumed him. He ordered the same thing each week, black coffee with no sugar and a blueberry muffin, not for taste, but because it had been Charlie's favorite. New staff might question it, but the old hands asked no more. They knew the unspoken significance of habit. But that week was different. When Harold entered, a cluster of young patrons near the door began to snicker. One raised his phone to film, sneering. A blonde girl, wearing bold lipstick, whispered loud enough that he heard, "What's this? A scarecrow for Halloween?" He did not flinch. His shoulders remained square, his steps even. Yet behind his steady gaze, a veil of memory flickered. Not hurt, but remembrance. Harold had seen death closer than anyone in that room, had held a friend's hand through his final breath, had called in artillery support on a crackling radio amid a hail of bullets. He'd watched children wail over their mothers' bodies, and comrades fall without a chance to close their eyes. Those sacrifices had bought the freedom that these mockers found so amusing. He sat, as always, back straight, eyes meeting nothing but the air. But unlike other times, no one came to take his order. No greeting, no kind glance. The server passed by 3 times, never pausing. Even when Harold tipped his head in the smallest nod, the server vanished. The chair across remained empty. Harold placed his hand on the tabletop, fingertips brushing the cold surface where Charlie once tapped along to an old tune. For a moment, he thought he heard his friend's warm, short laugh, but it was only a phantom. Outside, the mockers continued to film, overlaying cartoonish effects on his face, shrieking as though watching slapstick. No one knew who he was, no one asked, and Harold spoke no word, for what he carried needed no verbal recognition. It spoke for itself in the way he stood tall, always arrived on time, and ordered the same meal. Time moved more slowly in places devoid of compassion, but Harold was accustomed. In war, waiting was not a choice but a lifeline. He'd waited for reinforcements, for helicopters, for surviving comrades. Now he waited for his usual coffee, knowing it might never come. At last, a server approached, not with beverages, but with a question. "Are you really ordering, or just taking up space?" Harold replied softly, "Black coffee and a blueberry muffin." The server rolled her eyes and departed, never to return. He sat still, one hand over his heart, where his purple heart rested silent. Sometimes, silence is the only place honor can survive, and Harold Knox knew that better than anyone. The murmurs began the moment Harold crossed the threshold. A group of students, still wearing their school jackets, perched around the counter table, curiosity swiftly turning to mockery. One of them laughed out loud, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at him. Thinks he's some kind of general?" A phone was raised, the camera tracking Harold's every step. Time-lapse mode engaged, a snarky caption queued up. TikTok doesn't need context. Harold did not slow, nor react. He continued, his worn shoes whispering against the tiled floor with each heel strike. He had grown all too familiar with those looks. It wasn't the first time, and likely not the last. But something still ached inside him. Not anger, nor quite sorrow. More like a slipping away. Part of himself peeled off, cast into a void no one bothered to fill. He stopped at the counter and fixed his gaze on the server, a young woman entering orders on her tablet, never glancing up. He spoke softly. "Black coffee and a blueberry muffin." The words were brief, spoken with an instinctive certainty, yet they dissolved into the air without leaving a trace. She nodded carelessly, asked no questions, offered no smile, never even turned to fetch his order. Harold pivoted and walked to his usual table, the one he'd occupied for over 8 years, once shared by 2, now by 1. He pulled out the chair, placed his soft cap on the tabletop, then sat with practiced precision. His movements were heavy, but never lost their exactness. His eyes swept the café, youthful faces, vibrant chatter, laughter ringing out. No one met his gaze with understanding. A few glanced briefly, then looked away, as if his presence were a disruption. A woman shook her head, clicking her tongue at her companion. Others stared with cruel delight, his difference their free entertainment. Harold remained still, his hands folded on the table, holding his silence like a living statue. Yet inside, memories washed over him, old film reels rewinding without an audience. Every medal on his chest told a story, not of one man, but of a unit, of comrades who could no longer share their own. Some fell at his side, some perished when shells landed too close. Their voices were gone, leaving only distant echoes in Harold's ears each nightfall. But here, in this bright room, those memories had no spectators. Someone behind him laughed. A young man mimicked a salute, then bent at the waist like a circus performer. The whole table erupted in laughter. Harold did not turn. There was nothing to respond to. Everything unfolded in a tired rhythm, indifferent and relentless. A server passed by, her gaze sliding past him as if he were an empty chair. A flicker of hope that someone might see the man behind the uniform was extinguished without a word. He looked at the empty chair opposite, where Charlie once sat. He recalled Charlie's short, raspy laugh, how Charlie always saved a bite of muffin, saying, "Save it for later," then never ate it. Later had remained a slippery promise until it never came. Harold felt himself seated in a world that neither needed him nor remembered the sacrifices that had made its existence possible. A world rushing on with its glitter and yet deeply flawed. And what did he want? Nothing more than a cup of coffee, and respect for the memory of those who'd sat beside him, fought alongside him, who had sworn that if they survived, they would not let one another fade into oblivion. His watch ticked quietly. More than 20 minutes had passed. No order arrived. No explanation was offered. Harold opened his wallet, withdrew a $10 bill, and placed it on the table. Even though no one had served him, he paid, not out of duty, but out of faith in the order he once fought to uphold. He stood, straightened his jacket, his gaze unflinching. No one noticed. No one paused. Yet he walked out of the diner with the bearing of a man who would never allow himself to be broken. A man passed him, whispering something to his friend, then laughing again. Harold did not look back. Inside, he felt nothing but exhaustion, not from insult, but from the realization that sometimes the greatest things are the easiest to forget. Tension in the diner had built into an invisible wall. The old man sat motionless in his faded uniform amid a sea of curious and murmuring faces. There were sounds, just loud enough to shirk responsibility, yet loud enough to hurt. His half-hour of silence only seemed to aggravate the crowd. No one laughed out loud now, yet no one rose to do anything else either. Then, as if an unseen cord had been stretched to its breaking point, a sudden movement shattered the quiet. A boy of about 6 slipped free of his mother's hand and darted across the space between tables, his eyes wide. His small shoes struck the floor in determined steps, without hesitation. He stopped before the old man, looked up at the sun-hardened face etched with deep wrinkles like chasms carved by time. The entire room seemed to freeze in that moment. His mother called his name, but he did not turn. The diners stopped chewing, talking, pretending not to see. A child's gaze holds no judgment. It carries only pure curiosity. And in that instant, Harold looked down at the boy as if he were being seen for the first time by an eye capable of knowing him as he truly was. The boy tilted his head and asked, in a clear, unhesitating voice, "Did you really fight in a war, sir?" Harold paused for a heartbeat, not because he didn't know what to say, but because that question, so simple, so true, shook every defensive barrier within him. He lowered his eyes and nodded slowly. The words he spoke were not prepared. They were chosen from the depths of memory. "Yes," he whispered, his voice gravelly as dry sand. "But I didn't fight to strike anyone. I fought to protect those beside me." The child said nothing more. He just nodded. The respect in that gesture took Harold by surprise, not because it came from someone too small to understand war, but because it came at exactly the right moment, as if someone had listened to his memories for the first time in years. Then, the boy's mother appeared, her face tense, her eyes fixed away from Harold. She gripped her son's arm and pulled him away with a stiffness beyond necessity. "Don't bother people, Tyler," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. The boy glanced back once as he was led away. His eyes remained on the old man. Something in that look made Harold unable to look away, as though an entire generation was asking a question adults had forgotten. Why do we remain silent when we ought to be grateful? The diners returned to their soup and their half-finished conversations, but the air had changed. A few furtive glances toward Harold no longer carried disdain, but something like puzzlement, as if they'd just realized something was wrong, but lacked the courage to confront it. Harold sat there in silence, but this time, a gentle warmth crept into his wrinkles. Not because of an apology, nor because anyone's attitude had changed, but because that child, in his innocence, had done what no adult in the room dared, stepped forward, and saw him as a human being, not an outdated symbol. He turned his head to watch the mother and son fade behind the counter. There was no anger within him, only a vague sadness returned after so long, the sadness of knowing that misunderstandings born in this generation would repeat in the next unless someone stopped to correct them. His hand rose, lightly touching the metal on his chest, an unconscious gesture, as if to remind himself that no matter what, the reason he'd gone to war still held true. Not for recognition, but for the people he had never left behind. And now, perhaps, he had done the same, not letting a child walk away without knowing that true courage is a silent presence, requiring no shout, only a nod. Dear audience, take a moment to relax or have a drink, and stay tuned for more unexpected developments. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see viewers tuning in from around the world. Comment 1. If you enjoyed this story, so we can continue bringing you more great tales. He still stood there, beneath the narrow awning of the diner, his old cap pulled low, the dark uniform stained with spots of moisture. The hem of his coat clung to his chest, and the Purple Heart glinted where his heart began to shine beneath the dim light filtering through the glass. Inside, conversations fell into an unbidden silence. No one spoke, yet everyone felt something approaching. No one could explain the sensation, only that no one laughed anymore. Then came the low rumble of engines, unlike the everyday cars parked outside. 1, then 2, then 3 black SUVs with military plates rolled up in unison to the front doors. The doors opened. 6 Marines, uniforms immaculate, stepped out, each movement synchronized, weighty. They did not hurry, yet each step carried unmistakable purpose, as if rehearsed countless times. Inside, all eyes fixed on the windows. Phones rose, this time not for mockery. No one spoke. Some set down spoons, others pressed hands to their chests in a reflexive gesture of sudden respect. The diner's door swung open. The Marines marched in, boots wet, clicking softly yet resolutely. At their head was a captain, face impassive, but eyes steely and unmistakable. He halted in the center of the room. Everything seemed to stop breathing. The captain's voice rang out, not raised, yet each word echoed in the hush. The man standing out there saved my father's life, and the lives of 7 others, at the Battle of Ripcord in 1970. Every gaze shifted toward the door, where Harold still waited, unaware of the scene unfolding inside. We are here to say thank you, not only on behalf of my family, the Marine continued, but on behalf of all those who never had the chance to say it, and to give him what should have been his long ago. A wave of unrest coursed through the room. Faces that had once been indifferent now wore confusion. Some looked down at their hands, Others turned away, unwilling to meet the reflections in the eyes of the Marine. No one invited him, yet Harold stepped inside. Not quickly, nor slowly, only as if accustomed to moving forward while everyone else stepped back. His heavy boots left wet prints with each stride, yet his posture remained as straight as the day he first donned his uniform. As he entered, the 6 Marines snapped to attention, an unspoken, synchronized gesture that froze the entire room. No phones rose again, no more photos, no more videos, only eyes. Harold stopped before the captain. No greeting, no handshake, but between them lay recognition, silent, profound, and full of meaning. The captain withdrew a small wooden box from his jacket pocket. Inside lay a gleaming metal and a document embossed with a seal. No lengthy explanation was needed. Everyone understood. This was the official recognition Harold had never received. Lost paperwork, the passage of time, the neglect. No apology was spoken, yet every gesture carried it. As the captain pinned the medal to Harold's chest, tears slipped silently from the eyes of a young waitress, the very one who had once ignored his order. Mascara ran down her cheek. Something in her had broken apart, not from regret, but from realizing a truth too long ignored. Harold said nothing, but he raised his chin, his gaze sweeping the room. Those who had laughed now stood. Some placed hands over their hearts. Faces that had been strangers now held shame, gratitude, and an awakening. No applause followed. No need for it. That simple declaration, that he had saved a man's father and 7 others, was enough to change everything. Not because he was honored, but because the truth was finally spoken, in the right place, to the right people, and for Harold, that was enough. The room held its breath as Harold stepped forward. No whispers, no curious glances. Everyone in the diner stood frozen, as if any movement might shatter this sacred moment. At the center, flanked by Marines and stunned patrons, Harold stood tall, eyes fixed on the young captain holding an ornate wooden box. No one spoke. Only the soft tap of boots as a Marine approached, placed the box before the captain, and snapped to attention. The captain opened it to reveal a gleaming medal, no longer just a military emblem, but the symbol of a forgotten deed, now restored. Harold gazed at the medal as though seeing the faces of fallen comrades. His eyes were steady, unblinking, deep and calm enough to make those around him feel small before such quiet resolve. For extraordinary actions above and beyond duty, the captain read from the citation. For placing your life in the line of enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades, Staff Sergeant Harold Knox, 101st Airborne Division, is posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. Each word struck the floor like an unpullable nail, sure, irreversible. Harold accepted the medal with both hands. No one needed to teach him how to bow his head, how to hold his posture when receiving honor. Such things were natural to him, needing no rehearsal. Yet something shifted within him, small, subtle, but real, like an old wound touched, not hurting, but aching. Then came an unexpected moment. Another Marine stepped forward, carrying a large-frame display wrapped carefully. Inside lay a collage of time, photographs of their unit in Vietnam, 1970, handwritten letters in a firm, masculine script, dozens of signatures, names Harold hadn't heard in decades. "We all made it home because of you." The phrase, inked in bold black across the center, needed no flourish. Its power surpassed any speech. Harold's hand rose to the glass of the frame. The photos were yellowed, the signatures trembling with age. Yet in his heart each memory sprang alive. The gasping breath as he carried a wounded friend through enemy fire. The warmth of a dying comrade's shoulder as he dragged him back from the front. The final words left unsaid. He stood there, recognized by those who never knew him, for something he had never asked for. He had carried, for all those years, not medals or glory, but a promise to the fallen, that he would not forget them. Outside, the 6 Marines returned to formation. They turned in unison toward Harold, snapped to attention, and saluted. None had served alongside him, yet they saluted his legacy, not for rank, not for badge, but because he embodied the soldier's creed: leave no one behind. Harold returned the salute, steady and precise. His hand trembled, not from age, but because in that moment he felt he was no longer alone. Inside, those who had looked away when he ordered now bowed their heads in silence. A young server, the one who had passed him thrice without a word, wiped tears from her cheeks, clutching her tray as though to keep from collapsing with shame. No one dared speak. No one wanted to break the silence that had deepened into collective repentance. Harold turned back to his old table. This time, no one blocked his path. A natural aisle opened through the tables. When he sat down, a cup of black coffee and a blueberry muffin awaited him. No request needed. Harold uttered not a single word, yet everyone understood. Everything that needed saying had been spoken in action. And so, an ordinary day became a long overdue apology from an entire generation to the man who simply never forgot his duty. The photograph of Harold standing at attention, his salute sharp in that faded uniform, facing 6 young Marines in dress blues, spread across social media in an instant. No caption needed, no emoji required. That image spoke for itself, of respect, of atonement, and above all, of something modern society seems to have forgotten: dignity in silence. Within days, Eagle Diner was no longer just a roadside café. Those who had mocked Harold returned, not to eat, but to listen. Empty seats filled with veterans. They brought worn photographs, crumpled letters, fragments of forgotten memory, and together they began to tell their stories. Not for glory, but to preserve what nearly vanished: the memory of those who never came home. The mother who'd yanked her son away from Harold that day returned, this time with genuine need for understanding and to make amends. She approached his table and bowed her head in apology. No long speeches, only a gesture that made Harold nod gently, as though to say, "We can start again from here." The boy remained the same, wide-eyed and curious, but now carried new awareness. He no longer asked if Harold had fought in a war, but why people chose to stay. Harold did not answer immediately. He simply said, "You'll understand when you grow up. Some things only time can explain." The young man who'd filmed Harold, turning him into an online joke, deleted that video from his phone. More than that, he volunteered to apologize in person, an awkward, halting meeting made possible by Harold's simple words: "War taught me who deserves forgiveness. You're one of them." Months later, word spread that the young man had enlisted. No one knew exactly what changed him, but perhaps it was more than remorse. It was the desire to become part of something greater than himself. The diner's owner, once indifferent, mounted a bronze plaque above Harold's corner table, where he still came every Thursday. It read, "Table of the Silent Heroes, for those who gave everything without seeking remembrance. Respect needs no words, only deeds." Harold never claimed the hero's mantle. When someone approached his table with admiration, he merely shook his head. "I come here for those who once sat opposite me," he told a young reporter. "I'm just their storyteller." And indeed he was. In his eyes, it was the fallen Marines, the friends who shared that blueberry muffin and bitter black coffee, who truly compelled him to return, not out of habit, but out of duty, to bear witness, to keep their memory alive. Harold's story became an unofficial emblem of moral awakening in an age of indifference. Schools invited veterans to speak. Intergenerational dialogues became frequent, not to recount battles, but to talk about humanity, obligation, and loss. Because sometimes all it takes is one person standing still, in silence, in honesty, to make a community pause and reflect. And if you've watched this far, ask yourself, is there someone around you carrying a story that's never been heard? Thank you for joining us on this journey through living memories. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with family and friends across the United States, especially those who've served or know someone who sacrificed in silence. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Leave a comment below. Every story is a thread, and woven together, they form a tapestry called Unforgotten Memory. Thank you.